Hi, everybody. My name is Shuja, and welcome to the Parkish Show, where we talk about all things related to parking and transportation in the city of Boston. And what we like to do here is that we like to bring people on board, those thought leaders within the parking and transportation space that can give us a better sense of our changing urban space and how we're living today. And so today, I'm very excited that we have a very special guest all the way from the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. She has worked at the U.S. Department of Transportation, where she served as the acting assistant secretary for transportation policy and closely worked for Senator Tom Carper of Delaware as an advisor for transportation, trade, labor policy. And right now, she's joining us as the policy director of Smart Growth America, which is a part of the Transportation for America, an organization committed to urban planning, development, and building better towns and cities. So please welcome Beth Osborne, all the way from DC.
Thanks for having me.
Perfect. I am so excited. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Like many people, I am managing some distance learning out here in the background, which will
Right.
hopefully stay relatively unexciting, and trying to keep our issues afloat in a very strange time.
Exactly. I think we all share the same boat when it comes to that, just learning curve and hopefully making things happen. I think one of the first things, like going off with that, as you mentioned, is if you can give us a brief look. You've spent so much time in the transportation and parking space, is basically if you can give us a brief look into the transportation and parking space as how it has been affected by COVID-19 and the changes that has brought about.
Absolutely. And I think that's the right way to look at it. A lot of times we see transportation as an end unto itself, and really it's a means to an end. And we really see that during COVID, in that they're behaving differently because they are acting differently. They are moving differently. The need to move is different than it was before. So I don't commute anymore. My commute is generally to walk down the stairs to my basement.
Right.
It doesn't involve many modes of travel. I can't ride my bike there. I can't take a scooter there. I can't drive there. I can't take transit there.
Right.
And the impact is pretty big. We don't see as many people driving to a job center. We don't see as many people, taking transit. In fact, we don't see people really commuting much at all, except for essential workers. And you see this when you look at the pattern of traffic in major communities across the country, where there's really no morning peak anymore. What happens if you look at vehicle miles traveled throughout the day is people start traveling in the morning. They very slowly ramp up throughout the day until the crest of the hill is at around dinner time, and then it
Right.
falls off.
Exactly.
Very different than the V shape, or the V shape we used to see from morning commute and evening commute. And frankly, we have spent our entire history in transportation designing around the commute, and which we never should have done. But
Right.
it means that we're not particularly well prepared to handle the other trips, which are the only ones really happening right now. And it has profound impacts for a system designed to manage peak hour traffic, which we don't really have anymore, both on transit and on our roadways and in parking. Where we need parking is very different than we used to.
Exactly. I think that this is such a challenging times that people have to behaviors have changed. People are adapting to new things. It's an altogether a new world unto itself. And as you mentioned, you're just tracking those changes, which is such an eye-opening thing. And I think if you go back and look at it, if you used to work at the U.S. Department of Transportation, so if you can just enlighten us, just what are the key initiatives that you took when you were working at the U.S. Department of Transportation? What has been the effectiveness of the organization in resolving today's transportation concerns?
Well, that is a great question, and raises a lot of issues I have. So prepare.
Yeah.
So I spent 5 years at the U.S. Department of Transportation under Secretary LaHood and Secretary Fox. The thing I worked on there that I think was best known was a program that used to be known as the Tiger program, and it is now known as the Build program. And this was designed as a multimodal competitive grant program
Right.
unlike anything that the Department of Transportation had done before, been asked by Congress to do. It was to award funding based on the outcomes of an investment, whereas the overwhelming majority, if not almost the entirety of the program, has been based on coming up with a political split of funds for different purposes, and not
Right.
outcomes, but modes. So highways get 80%, and of that, a certain amount, a tiny amount, can be used for bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, and transit gets 20%. It's not about what we will get for any of those investments. It's whether or not
Right.
that is considered a fair and politically manageable allocation of dollars
Exactly.
to different types of interest groups and modes. And Tiger, now Build, put that on its head and said, I don't care what the mode is. Does it accomplish our priorities, which are improving safety, economic competitiveness, livability, environmental sustainability, and the state of repair of the system? And I think we should seek to redesign the entirety of the program in that way. So I'd say that's the thing I was most excited about working on. We also tried to break down some silos between the agencies and worked very closely with Housing and Urban Development, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture on all of our programs that invest in infrastructure in places. And that was a really exciting initiative. But in terms of what our lasting impact was, other than that Tiger Build program, right, which is about 1% of overall federal spending on surface transportation, I don't think we did have a very big impact. And it's something that I find very frustrating. Was the reason I left, was we didn't go after the real issue, which is the way our money is spent, which requires a collaboration with Congress to update their approach from the current one that was really set in motion in 1982. And, I say that this program is really stuck in the past. The federal understanding from a lot of members of Congress is really stuck in the past. There's not a lot of deep thinking around it. And I came out and came Transportation for America to try and encourage people to think a little bit more deeply about what we should be getting from the program and how our investments impact others.
And that's an amazing insight. And I think I would love to learn more about what you've done at Transportation for America and Smart Growth America. But one of the things that really concerns people, and I think that was one of the even decisions that you took, is what is this reason behind the disconnect between policymakers in DC and the on-ground realities in terms of transportation? Like, what is the disconnect? Is there some sort of lack of communication or miscommunication, or what do you think how we can bridge that gap?
That's a great question, and I have a controversial answer.
All right.
A lot of folks may not realize that the way the federal government pays for transportation is we collect an 18.4-cent sales tax on your or user fee on every time you buy a gallon of gasoline. And there's a tax on diesel as well. And there's some other taxes on tires and things like that. But the overwhelming majority of it is that gas tax. And that goes into a trust fund that it has been seen as a very important part of the program. Departments of Transportation don't have to go to Congress every year and beg for funding. Their funding is guaranteed over the long haul. It is outside of the yearly budgetary system that Congress uses for almost every other program in the federal government. And that means if you have to build, a $100 million project, you're not getting pieces of funding year by year until you have enough money to build it. You have some guarantee into the future that you'll have enough money that you can do major projects.
Right.
So that is a basis. I will say that trust fund approach has actually generated a massive disconnect between federal policymakers and what's going on the ground. Federal policymakers, members of Congress, and I've worked for members on both the House and the Senate side, they know what comes up. If you're a member of the House, you have a 2-year term. Many people are not in office beyond 4 or 6 years. The transportation bill comes up about every 6 years. You're not going to have great expertise in an area you only consider every 6 years. Right. And in terms of your staffing, if you've got 3 staff to cover every issue that might come before Congress, like most members of the House do, you're not going to dedicate one of them to become a transportation expert because it might come up during their term. Most staff are there for 2 to 3 years. This bill comes every 6 years, at least. Sometimes it's 8 years. So there's this massive disconnect in terms of thinking deeply about the program, or more importantly, having to justify its existence and its funding level.
Right.
It's been on automatic pilot for a long time. All they've had to do is come up with ways to backfill the shortfall on a regular basis, which has been easy enough because no one wants to cut their state's funding. And now we're coming to the end of where that money is going to come from. So maybe we finally get to a point where members of Congress have to say, why do we want to fund this program at such a large level? How do I convince the American people that more money should go into this program as opposed to other programs? And we've seen some deeper thinking about it on the House side, but I would really a complete lack of deep thinking about it in the U.S. Senate.
I mean, that's such an insight that a lot of people might not be privy to, and I think we want to know where our tax-paying money, where is all of that money going to? And I think, as you mentioned, that's such a great look into that world and how those decisions are being made. And I think that's such a great segue into finding out what role exactly is Transportation for America playing in differentiating itself from what the Transportation Department is playing, and seeing how are you pushing the conversation when it's doing that. So I would love to know what has your role been and what's the organization been doing.
Well, Transportation for America is a national nonprofit focused on creating a transportation system that connects people to jobs and essential services, whether we're talking education, the grocery, medical care, retail, parks, whatever it is, by multiple modes of travel. So that's driving, transit, walking, biking, whatever, no matter their financial means or their physical ability. We do our work through research and analysis of the existing system, how it's working, how it's not working, through direct technical assistance to those localities or states or regional entities or transit agencies that want to do what we're seeking to do through our mission, and through policy development and policy advocacy, often at the federal level, but also we do some advocacy at the state and local level as well, and certainly policy development with the Coalition of the Willing. What we did that I think broke from the historic approach, agreement, I don't even know what to call it. The typical approach of stakeholders to the transportation program at the federal and at state level has been, we'll all work together and that collaboration will lift all boats. Right. Especially for those of us who are interested in boosting alternative forms of transportation, a term I hate because all forms of transportation should be alternatives. But in transportation, we view driving as the real form of transportation. And those other things as niceties that we might get to with the detritus left over from the program. We want to see a more outcome-based approach. And if the outcome, for example, is to improve access to jobs for those who can't afford a car, then it turns out the highway is not the appropriate investment. So we want to move more in that direction. And whereas throughout my career, I've seen those engaged in transit, walking, and biking as saying, I will let the overall program continue to do damage to people's access to these other modes, as long as you give me a much smaller portion to retrofit the damage you're doing with a much bigger pot. Right. Is a deal I personally am unwilling to participate in. And so when I took over Transportation for America, we pulled together stakeholders, some are members, some are partners, and talked about what we wanted. And we developed 3 policy goals. But even before you get to the policy goals, we did something no one has done, which said this program should not get another dime. It probably doesn't deserve the money it's getting now until we see these changes and this program is updated from where it started it started 60 years ago, but really hasn't changed from 40 years ago.
Right.
And that was a gasp moment within the transportation arena that we didn't agree to support more money for the program, because that is the cost of admission for everybody else.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of people that thought by taking that position we wouldn't be invited into congressional offices. Turns out that was wrong. We were invited into far more. They wanted to hear about the policy changes we want to see. And if you go to our website, you will see we talk about three policy goals. One is a fix-it-first approach to our transportation system. We always hear about our crumbling roads and bridges, but there's nothing in our program that encourages anyone to focus on fixing that infrastructure. It's perfectly allowable to build something new you already know you can't afford to maintain while not maintaining your existing program. We don't think that should be permissible. You should have to take good care of the stuff we pay for you to build.
Exactly.
We do that on the transit side, though we could do a better job on the transit side. We don't even attempt it on the highway side. The second thing is to put safety first for real, which means putting the safety priority ahead of the priority of moving vehicles quickly. What we generally mean at the federal level and at the state level when we talk about safety is, how do we make the system as safe as possible as long as cars are driving through your neighborhood at 50 miles per hour? And that is a premise I'm not willing to accept. We let cars go too quickly in places that it's inappropriate, and that level of speed leads to far more fatalities than we should see. In fact, it results in as many fatalities as impaired driving. And so we want to see safety put before speed. Yes, as a driver, you will have to go slower in places where people and development are. And then the third is reorienting the program away from moving vehicles quickly, which is the 1956 let's build interstate highway approach that has now been taken as a one-size-fits-all dictate down to even our local streets. Let's instead move to one that's about connecting people to jobs and services. And thanks to GIS, we have the ability to measure full trips, which we don't do in the transportation system. When you hear about improving your commute, they're really only looking at one window and presuming if they improve your speed, that your overall trip will get faster. That actually turns out to be wholly false. You tend to lose that time improvement. We do things that cut off trips this way across the corridor to improve this, so other people's trips are harmed, and it pushes development further out, so your overall trip is so much further, your time savings doesn't help you. We want to reorient that so that we're really thinking about the full trip a human being is taking. Sure. And in doing so, we'll have a much better sense of how our investments impact quality of life and the time that people have to spend and money they have to spend on transportation. So not another dime, probably not even the same amount of money for this program without those changes. And it really has pushed a different conversation. We're a little organization, so have we completely changed everything? No. But there are conversations happening now that haven't happened before. Yeah. So I'll take the credit for that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think even living here in Texas, where I'm currently based right now, I think you see these almost awkward turns, awkward policies when you're driving in the street and you're like, how is this even safe? Or this could lead to a lot of potential accidents, which you do end up seeing sometimes, like, yes, now I have to be careful. And maybe it's at the cost of maybe more speeding, trying to be more faster, and that leads to, as you mentioned, unfortunate fatalities, which we want to reduce that. And I think when you come to a city like Boston, where Park is based and where we've been growing from there, it's an old city. It's not one of those newer cities. It is a complex system of transportation there. We've got the MBTA, we've got commuter rail, we have the bus system, and there's a lot of the economy of the city that's connected through the MBTA using the public transportation, which you don't see a lot here in the Texas or in other states. So how can a city, an older city like Boston, resolve its growing parking concerns? And is there not an interest within the state of Massachusetts or the Boston city government not to focus on improving there, or is that just they're still trying to crack it? Is there an interest to help people park better or not within the economy, within the system?
Well, I think we have to do a little bit better job of defining what the parking problem is and what people's expectations should be, and what is the job of the city and state to guarantee to those travelers in its community. So
Right.
we work on parking in a whole lot of places. In fact, one of my partners from the Form-Based Codes Institute helped to rewrite some parking codes for folks. And one thing we find is when people say, parking's bad, I can't find parking, which, by the way, they say in every single community in the United States of America, no matter how much parking is available. They mean I can't find a parking space right in front of where I want to go to every time I want to go there.
Right. Right.
And I would argue, not my job, not anybody's job. You want to travel someplace at the peak of that area's popularity, you're going to have to walk.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think to some extent we have to define what we mean. Is it our job to make sure that in front of every single building, there must be parking available all the time? If so, all you've got to do is bulldoze Boston and turn it into one gigantic strip mall, and you'll have all the parking you want.
Yeah.
But look, Boston, the reason it has walkability, the reason it has transit, is we haven't prioritized the convenience of every single driver to drive down to one location at the same time and all park right in front of a building.
Right.
That is what you find in the suburbs and the exurbs, and we find that the lifespan of those communities is rather short. We've already seen the first ring suburbs go through a lot of their lifespan. The second ring suburbs are already following that same strategy or that same lifespan, except theirs seems to be shorter. So I don't know that guaranteeing vast amounts of parking is a particularly good goal. I think we should be prioritizing access to the things people need. And it might mean that you've got access that does not include the convenient parking you might like right in front. But the other thing I would say is, especially in a city like Boston, their land is extremely valuable because so many people want to be located in that area. How much of that space, that incredibly valuable space that could be generating, tax receipts for the city, profits for business, should we dedicate to the storage of people's personal automobiles? I would argue very, very little, which is why pricing those spaces is extremely important, because those are incredibly valuable pieces of property. And it helps people recognize the resource they are using, and it helps them make more rational decisions. If we're going to give away massive swaths of land to storage of everybody's personal vehicle, I mean, for free, people will use it wastefully, because when things are free, we waste things. When they're more expensive, we treat them with much more care.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think pricing things so that there can actually be a marketplace for them is a really important part of making sure people really want that extra space to go to parking or not, or really want to make that extra trip in their car. So, for example, if you've got a parking space that you've already paid for and your next visit is 4 blocks away, maybe you just decide to walk that.
Right.
But if it's free and it's plentiful, you probably drive it. And that's why, you've got places in Texas that have dozens of parking spaces available for every single vehicle in that community, which is just not only a massive waste of space, but an inefficient use of property, and communicating very clearly to the market that that community does not think its land is worth that much.
Right. And that's true. I think that is such a clear insight. Like, you see that very much happening even in Texas. And then when you mentioned like space is so valuable, has been put so much value in Boston that everything needs to be taken care of accordingly. I think one of the things that while working at Parques, what we've realized, and going to your point, is that there is parking, but it remains underutilized, that it remains out of the reach of the average consumer, the average commuter, who needs to know that there is parking. We don't need to build newer spaces. We already have space. What can a company like ours, Parques, can do to increase that usability of those and accessibility of those spaces. So I think because we don't need more spaces, we already have a lot of them. How can we increase that awareness and that communication that will make it easier for people to approach them?
So I'd say two things. You're absolutely right. Every place has more parking availability than people realize. I think in places like Boston and DC and Philly and New York, which are older communities, that may be harder to find. But making sure we're getting full utilization of the parking that already exists before we're seeking to build and dedicate more valuable space to it is essential. And letting the consumer know where it is really important as well, so that they're not just circling looking for parking and creating unnecessary use of the roadway when people are trying to get through. I would also say the most important thing that any company that is offering a service or a product that interacts with a public utility or a public space is working closely with the city. The cities, especially cities like Boston, that frankly are way ahead of other cities across the country, they are trying to do much more interesting and thoughtful things with their curb space and with parking than we've ever tried to do before. And making sure that you are aligning with their priorities is a really, really important part of making sure the product is going to be fully adopted in the region and really play into the regional goals.
That's amazing. I think that's the way forward for us too, that working with the city and, making sure that the public, the community has a better use of this, a better use of the product, better use of the services that is around them, and then we can hopefully empower them through those processes. I think just to end it off, if you have such amazing insight, what do you think now the future of American cities look like in terms of transportation? And is there a way that as people of communities, people are who want to make, is there a way they can make better informed decisions when it comes to parking and transportation, particularly?
So the first question is enormous. We are in a time of incredible change. I will say I don't trust anyone who says that everything's going to change. I don't trust anyone who says that nothing's going to change. And I don't trust anyone who tells me that they know exactly how things are going to change. All I will promise people is that we will see change, and it will be something between everything and nothing. And that's all the specifics I will offer. I think that the transportation system and the built environment were changing before COVID. COVID has definitely accelerated a lot of that. It has empowered a lot of communities to just experiment and try new things because we found ourselves in the middle of an emergency, in closing streets to auto traffic, in using more of the roadway for public and retail space to keep businesses alive, to allow people to be active in the asset that turns out to be the overwhelming majority of our public space. We shouldn't be watching transportation. We should be watching the totality of what's going on. Exactly. Are we seeing the strengthening of neighborhoods and local communities over downtowns? Are we seeing downtowns start to transform into areas that have more housing and become its own more local area as well? Are we seeing telecommuting continue in big numbers? And before I go beyond that, I want to make clear that a big earth-shattering change would be if telecommuting goes up to a permanent level of 10 or 15%.
Okay, amazing.
And that's, we don't have peaks anymore. At 10 or 15%, that's transformative. And we're looking at a potential of 5 days a week telecommuting for 30%. And of the other 70%, the overwhelming majority say they don't want to go back to the workplace 5 days a week. So 1, 2, 3 days at home. I mean, that's overwhelming. People seem to think if you don't have 100% change or 80% change, you don't have change. In transportation, in DC, the difference between free-flowing traffic in August and the rest of the year is like a reduction of traffic of 5%. It's all it takes to transform everything. So I think we need to look at what's going on in the macro, in the broad sense, and watch what's happening in the change of our built environment and get better at measuring what that means in terms of how it's going to impact transportation and where there's going to be demand for parking in the first place, and not just demand for parking, but at what time of day and what points during the week we will need that parking.
I think that is such a, I mean, just saying these things that even a significant change is a big change onto itself. We don't need to have 100% change, but even the small increments of changes that's happening is going to change the way we live. It's going to change how we build communities. It's going to change the way
Mm-hmm.
we work, commute, everything. I think that is such an amazing insight, and we think that's definitely the way forward too. We would, that's a huge change. And we truly,
Absolutely.
yeah, truly believe that. It's I'm absorbing it now. Like I'm going through that. But yeah, but no, I think this is great, Beth, that you joined us with us today to share your invaluable insights. I think what you've said will definitely help our community, our Parkes community, people in the city of Boston, people who are watching and listening to our show. I think it's going to be such a great, because a lot of this is remains unheard of. People who don't know that there is a conversation going on. You want to bring it to the people that, hey, this is what our policymakers, this is people within the nonprofit organizations, or people who are striving to build better communities. What are they thinking? What is to them is of would create the biggest impact? And I think what you've discussed today is going to be completely valuable. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. This was a fun conversation.
Absolutely. I will share your, we can all go up and learn more about what Transportation for America is doing. It's the following link, and we can all look and reach out to Beth, who's doing an amazing job there. I think this is going to be such a great conversation that we've had today. Well, with that being said, I'd like to just conclude the show with saying that please do follow us at We Are Parquets on Instagram or Facebook or our LinkedIn, and we're definitely gonna be keeping you up to date with what's going to be happening within the transportation space, both in Boston and the rest of the America. So thank you so much. Have a great day.